Hello, 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 everybody. All right, so can everyone see and hear me without issue? Excellent. So, just share the screen and we'll get started talking about today's material, which is all about the uncanny. So, I want to say a couple things before we launch into this. What am I doing? All right, slideshow from beginning. Just a couple things I'd like to preface this with. One is that this is kind of based on a long-standing research interest of mine. I guess that really goes all the way back to my undergraduate days when I was introduced to some of these ideas that we'll mention today from Ernst, Jentsch, and Sigmund Freud, but also other kind of related stuff like the uncanny valley phenomenon, which we can talk about today if time permits. All of that was introduced. I was introduced to during my undergraduate years, so I've been interested in the psychology of the uncanny for a long, long time. Uh, before I was doing this course, certainly. Before I had any interest in like anomalistic psychology or anything like that. Um, Another thing I think is worth at least noting is that this is actually a version of a talk I gave. The story behind this lecture is an interesting one because it sort of started as a couple of lectures in this class that then morphed into a talk that I gave for an online conference that was held by the Center for Inquiry Canada. And that was a really fun experience. It was still during COVID. So that's why it was online. But I always remember the keynote speaker was really cool. The keynote speaker was, in fact, William B. Davis, who is an actor. In fact, among his credits, his acting credits, are the cigarette is the cigarette smoking man from the X-Files. So that was really cool. I was really nervous though because I presented right before he gave his keynote address. So it probably helped that everything that was online helped with a bit of that performance anxiety, right? This went from like lectures to a talk, back to lectures, right? I've kind of taken this talk and turned it back into a lecture, which is what I'll be delivering to you today. There was a quick question in the chat about the reflection assignment. No, it's not going to be due on Friday anymore. I'm actually going to change the deadline to next Tuesday. So I was thinking I would make it due on Monday. But Monday's a holiday, right? So this way you have the rest of the week and you can work on it over the weekend if you want to. It won't take you very long to do, right? It's like, what did I say, 500 to 750 words in the description in the course outline. So it's not it's not super brutal. And this evening, I'm going to make available a template. So I'll put that together after class. The template will have instructions as well as a kind of miniature rubric. So it'll indicate what I expect. What I will award an A range mark for, what'll get you a mark in the B range, the C range, etc. Right? But basically, it's going to have kind of like two parts. The one part is where you're going to describe your experience, your encounter with the paranormal, the anomalous, or perhaps even something uncanny. Um, and then the second part will ask you to reflect on that experience and how it's shaped your beliefs, or your skepticism, or your agnosticism about the paranormal, right? And keep in mind that it can be, we're treating this broadly, right? So, you can write about anything. Maybe you went on a haunted walk, right? You know, those tours that they have. We have them in Ottawa. In fact, you can go on a haunted walk and visit allegedly haunted locations. Maybe you saw something strange in the sky. and you didn't know what it was, and you thought for a moment, oh, maybe that's a UFO, right? Maybe you had like an episode of sleep paralysis. Maybe as far as the uncanny stuff goes, maybe you went to a wax museum and it freaked you out a little bit, right? So I'm going to invite you to to describe your experience and reflect on it. And all of this will be in the instruction section of the template that I provide you with. So you shouldn't need too much by way of further instruction from me. Um, as long as you hit those two things, that's what the assignment calls for, describing an experience and reflecting on it. So why are we talking about the uncanny? Well, I think that if we could have a naturalistic account of the psychology of the uncanny, that would make an interesting contribution to anomalistic psychology, which I talked a little bit about last time. Right? Anomalistic psychology is an area of psychology which sort of seeks to replace parapsychology by explaining anomalous psychological states naturalistically, or by at least if we can't explain them, by not positing non-naturalistic explanations. And we'll be looking at Jentsch and Freud on this. So that's why I had you read those two essays. Lena, go ahead.
Sorry, I just had a clarifying question. When we talk about naturalistic like theories, are they skeptics? Are they trying to disprove, or are they so much just explaining it different ways?
They're skeptics in the sort of scientific sense, like they're investigating, right? But they're doing so under that methodological naturalism approach. And so when I say a naturalistic explanation, I mean, um, I guess the weak version of that would be operating like a scientist, a methodological naturalist. The stronger version of that would be metaphysical naturalism, like we talked about last time. And they're not trying to disprove in the sort of sense of skepticism as doubt, but they are trying to investigate in that sense. Right. So I think there are some interesting differences between the approaches of Jentsch and Freud here. But there are actually some very noteworthy similarities. In fact, I think Freud essentially just kind of appropriates Jentsch's explanation for the uncanny, for the psychology of the uncanny, and dresses it up in this sort of psychoanalytic, uh, coat. Like that's not a Freudian theory. That's Jentsch's ideas stacked up in a trench coat or something, right? So that's kind of my take on this. Um, you may agree, you may disagree. I guess it depends how much of a Freudian you are. I'm not one. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I think actually where I'm going to end up with this is that Jentsch actually got the answer right, and that Freud's attempts to improve upon it are really kind of superfluous. And I'll explain. I'll explain as we go why I think that is. But what is the uncanny, and why on earth are we talking about it now, right? It's not an easy word to define because we use it differently when we use it. It's not a common word. We don't often use this word, at least not in 21st century English, in our sort of everyday talk with one another, right? But maybe some synonyms are, like weird, strange, certainly unhomely, in the sense of unfamiliar, in the sense that you're out of your element. Eerie is a big one. And as we'll see, there are often associated with uncanny persons, places, circumstances, etc. Something that's maybe a little bit weird, paranormal, supernatural. Not always, but sometimes. So I thought that before we launch into this, I would like to hear from you. Um, Firstly, like, is this a word you've used, like ever? And if you have, What have you described as uncanny? Could be an experience, a place, a person, an event, a set of circumstances. Or if it's not something you yourself have experienced and described this way, what have you heard described this way? You say, oh, that was uncanny, right? I've already given a hint for one, which will sort of come in. Uh, it'll be important later on when we talk about Jentsch, and that is the wax museum, right? You've ever gone to a wax museum like Madame Tussauds or the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum or something like that? The Thatcher effect. It's what do you mean? I'm not familiar with that term.
I don't know if you've ever seen those, but it's like those like pictures where you see like either a celebrity or a person you know like upside down, and then when you like
Oh,
put it back up, they just don't look right. And
yeah,
so
that's
they
right. Okay, yes. So I have heard of that phenomenon. I just wasn't familiar with the name, but that was one of the pictures. Yeah, that's a weird quirk of our facial recognition systems. We're used to perceiving faces, oriented a certain way, namely right side up, right? And when we flip the face upside down, it actually becomes very difficult to recognize faces. So that's where that effect comes from. And I guess, yeah, that could be a little bit uncanny, right? Um, so there are so Kaya says there are like uncanny makeup trends, I guess maybe to make yourself look a bit eerie. Leo, of course, yeah, the uncanny valley. Yeah, like robots that look almost human, but not quite human, and we can kind of tell there's something off about them. Yet that will come in handy in our discussion later. I'm sorry, I'm just making sure my transcript is working. Um, I forgot to do that last time. So if I ever forget to do that, please remind me because that is important for accessibility reasons. Um, okay. Okay, perfect. Good, good, good. Yeah, anything animated, like Nina says, anything animated with dead eyes. And I would, yeah, that's a good one. And I would offer, in addition to that, anything inanimate with seemingly living eyes. So, you know, stuff that's animated with dead eyes, like how we see certain, maybe creatures depicted in horror films, um, or the opposite version, um, a painting or a photograph whose eyes seem to follow you across the room. That's also quite strange, right? A little eerie, a little weird, a little uncanny. Yeah, Zach, sounds like that's like the uncanny valley, but not just when it comes to robots. Um, Potentially anything. Um, Gravity Falls. I haven't seen Gravity Falls. Perhaps I should. Um, AI pictures. Yeah, I find AI pictures, especially I also find AI videos can be a little uncanny, but not uncanny in a weird or an eerie way, just in a strange way, right? And the etymology, I think, of the word uncanny reflects this, right? It comes from an old English word. Um, like canny is related to ken, which is your home. So, um, yeah. Yeah, teddy bear with human teeth. Very weird, yeah. Um, and we still have this saying in English, like when I say, if I were to say to you, like, oh, you are beyond your ken, that means you're outside of your area of knowledge, expertise, familiarity. You're far from home. You're not in Kansas anymore, basically. We also describe people who are wise or clever as canny, right? And again, this comes from Ken, right? So uncanny is like unhomely, unfamiliar, strange. kind of in that sense of strange, like strange as in foreign and unfamiliar to us, right? Um, Now, uncanny doesn't always have connotations of the paranormal or the supernatural, but it sometimes does, and that's why I think it's interesting to discuss it in a context like this. Um, we also talk about people with uncanny abilities, right? And this could be sort of fantastical, like the X-Men. Um, it could be kind of paranormal, like maybe you think that there are psychics, mediums, and those sorts of people whose abilities, if they exist, would be uncanny. Or indeed more generally, like ESP, PK, these abilities, if they were shown to be real, that would be pretty weird. That would be strange, that would be uncanny. Um, we talk about uncanny resemblances sometimes, right? So, if some person bears a striking resemblance to someone else, we could say that the resemblance is uncanny, almost as if they're twins, but they're not twins, right? So, um, I have to admit that I'm actually not very susceptible to the uncanny valley phenomenon, at least where robots are concerned, because I've been overexposed to robots, um, and I don't find them very strange at all. Um, but yeah, a doppelganger. When we say there's an uncanny resemblance, it might be like a doppelganger or a double goer. That's what that word translates to in English, a double goer. And Freud actually talks about doppelgangers in his essay. I'll tell you one thing which I found very uncanny. Um, and that was last April. Um, I actually I made sure that I was not going to miss this. It was the on I believe the 8th, the total solar eclipse that was visible across much of North America. I always wanted to see an eclipse. And I've seen lunar eclipses. Those are whatever, lunar eclipses. I've seen partial, total. Those are very common. Solar eclipses happen once about every 18 months, but their locations across the planet changes. And the next one that would have been visible in the area, just south of Ottawa, close to the US border, would not see another eclipse for like another nearly 400 years. So I canceled class and I told all my students, go and see this if you can. I almost saw an annular eclipse when I was a young fella in, I think it was the third grade in Southern Ontario. But they kept us all inside because they were afraid that we would fry our eyeballs looking at the sun. I was always very bitter about that. I thought the school should have prepared for this. They should have got everybody eclipse glasses, and we could have made like a scientific educational experience out of it, right? But alas, no, they didn't do that. They just made us stay inside. So finally, I get to see an eclipse, and my partner and I drive down to Cornwall where we could get into the path of totality. And I had my glasses on, watching for uh, what's the technical term? I believe the technical term when you enter totality is second contact. So first contact is when the moon starts to occlude the sun. When you move into totality, that's second contact. When you move out of totality, third contact. And when the sun or when the moon finally finishes passing over the sun, that's fourth contact. And I had my glasses and I was watching and I saw the little sliver of light disappear. And I thought, oh, okay, time to see the eclipse. And I took my glasses off, and I just was not ready for what I saw, right? All of a sudden, it was cold. The shadow that the moon casts on the Earth cools the air down, and so this cool breeze kind of follows that shadow. Everything went eerily quiet. It was the middle of the day and the stars were out. And there was this weird, it wasn't like quite nighttime and it wasn't quite like daytime. It was this weird twilight sort of thing all around the sky. And the moon was just black, jet black, with this white halo around it and these little purple solar flare things that you could see. It was like being on another planet. It was the weirdest, most uncanny thing I've ever experienced. Yeah. I wonder, yeah, Belle, sounds like you saw it too. Did anyone else see this? And did you think, oh, wow, this is weird? I didn't just think it was weird. I thought it was amazing, but I was also like, wow, this is like eerie, right? This is crazy. I could see why ancient people who, maybe didn't understand what an eclipse was, I could see why they would get freaked out. All of a sudden, what the hell? Where's the sun? What's happening to the sky? You could see why it would freak you out if you didn't understand what was happening. Yeah. I had some friends, Kaya, who said when they saw the birds started singing as if it was evening. Where I was, at least, the birds went silent. It was quite strange. Yeah, very interesting. So that's my favorite uncanny experience. Why should we study all of this? Well, like I said, I think that this would make an interesting contribution to anomalistic psychology, right? Not just understanding why people believe in, ESP or ghosts or whatever, right? Pick your paranormal phenomenon. It's not just about understanding why people believe in these phenomena, but also I think it would be interesting to understand why people, um, what those experiences are like, right? When we have an anomalous experience, like why does it feel the way it does? And that's where I think this stuff could come in handy, right? Now, the origins of all this go back to Ernst Jentsch's paper and Sigmund Freud's paper. But most research on the uncanny happens in the humanities. So we're talking literature, like Gothic literature, like Hoffman's short story, and of course poem, film too, right? There are kind of some uncanny moments in film. I remember talking about. There's one scene in this new wave French movie. It's called Vivre sa vie, which means living one's life or one's life to live, right? Um, where the character is having a conversation with a philosopher in a cafe. And there's one point at which our main character, played by Anna Karina, she just looks at the camera and it feels really strange because you're like, hey, this is a movie. They're not supposed to look at me in the audience. Like she's looking through that fourth wall, so that's an uncanny moment from a film that I always remember. It's been talked about in feminism and queer theory, cultural studies, and architecture. Again, you've got Gothic and Neo-Gothic architecture, right? So, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the uncanny. We've got a lot of Neo-Gothic architecture in Ottawa, in fact, right? If you go and, I think it's pretty difficult to tour Parliament Hill now because they're currently earthquake proofing it. But get yourself a pair of binoculars or go online and look at pictures, and you'll see the neo-Gothic characteristics like the gargoyles and stuff, right? Of course, another sort of parallel line of inquiry into the uncanny is the one we find in robotics research, the cognitive sciences. That's the uncanny valley. But neither of these, I think, are really aimed at understanding the uncanny in the way that an anomalistic psychologist might want to understand it. And that is um, that understanding is a naturalistic explanation of the psychology of the uncanny. Um, and this might do some things for those other areas I've mentioned too, right? I think if we, and this was actually the point of my master's thesis was kind of about this. I wanted to make empirical research on the uncanny valley phenomenon more precise, and I found that although there was a lot of good work, that I think really was hitting upon the right answer, and that is that basically a kind of ontological uncertainty, right? You see a robot or a computer animated figure, and you know it's not real, but it kind of pushes those mental buttons that we use when we're interacting with things that are alive. Um, So it's kind of like a categorization problem, right? That's what the at least the psychology literature seems to indicate with respect to the uncanny valley. It's like you see a robot, you know it's inanimate, but your brain is like, oh, that's animate, that's a living thing, and so you have this sort of difficulty categorizing it. That doesn't explain the phenomenology of the uncanny valley, though, which is why I tried to make things a little bit more precise in that project. They also kind of play fast and loose with the terminology, right? They don't really seem to be interested in what eeriness actually is or uncanniness or what I'll argue toward the end of this talk that eeriness is an emotion. It's actually a type of anxiety. But I'll say more about that later. I also think that some of this might give us new insights for the discussion of the uncanny and the humanities, right? They're not, again, not interested so much in the psychology of it as they are in, I don't know, maybe using it as a literary device, kind of like Hoffman does, right? But I think maybe we could get better at that with a better understanding of the uncanny. Maybe we could make our scary stories even scarier, right? If we wanted to. Um, and of course, it would make a good contribution to anomalistic psychology. Now, I've covered a lot of this here in this second bit previously, so I won't say too much more. I'll just remind you that it's a branch of philosophy or a branch of psychology that was initiated by Robert Westcott, an anthropologist. It studies anomalistic psychological states. So, you know, weird stuff like this, like we read in the Jones and Zisney paper from last time, precognitive dreams, cases of miraculous healing, sleepwalking, and automatic behaviors, as well as all cases of severe psychopathology. We used to describe all of this stuff um, supernaturally, essentially, right? Precognitive dreams nowadays. We can be reasonably certain that precognitive dreams are by and large a matter of coincidence. Miraculous healings, again, sometimes people just get better, right? Sometimes you have cancer and that cancer goes into remission and we don't know why, right? Sleepwalking, what's that all about? Nowadays we have a pretty good understanding you know, I'm not going to say a complete understanding of somnambulism. That's the medical term for sleepwalking, but we do recognize it as a medical sort of phenomenon, right? So it could be a result of you know, maybe you have a sleep disorder or something that causes somnambulism. Automatic behaviors. These are behaviors that you know, there's some ambiguity surrounding this term, but what it seems to refer to is doing things unconsciously, right? Like trying to come up with an example. But when we talk about when we talk about automaticity in you know, nowadays in psychology, we mean stuff that we can do more or less automatically. Think about like what an expert does, like an expert at whatever. Um, Maybe an expert piano player. And so they're playing the concerto and they're playing it real great. And you're like, wow, that's such an amazing performance. But to the pianist, they're not thinking about what they're doing. They're just doing it. In fact, thinking about it would probably make them screw it up, right? So they just do it automatically. And then psychopathology, right? Mental illness. Um, These are all anomalous, but we all understand more or less that they have naturalistic explanations. But stuff like the precognitive dreams also seem to violate our understanding of how nature works, right? About space, time, cause and effect. These are, like limiting principles of naturalism again. Um, and some of these were attributed to supernatural or paranormal causes, just as some of them are perhaps also associated with an eerie or an uncanny feeling. So, a couple of examples here. One actually mentioned by Jentsch is epileptic seizures, right? A grand mal seizure, where you're having convulsions and everything. It was thought um, at certain points in our past that this was a sort of divine illness, right? It's an affliction that comes from the gods. But now we understand it's a neurological disorder. So that's the supernatural cause to a naturalistic cause. That's that change. But also, as Jentsch points out, observing somebody undergoing a grand mal seizure is very strange, right? Because not only is it frightening, but it's strange in the sense that you're watching movements that this person who was awake and aware moments ago is not in conscious control of. So that's another way in which things can be kind of paranormal, kind of weird, kind of uncanny, all at the same time, right? Um, I don't think I have to say too much about this. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking. So I won't say too much about this, but I will sort of reiterate that anomalistic psychology attempts to be a bit more neutral than parapsychology. Parapsychology often assumes a sort of paranormal or supernatural explanation. Anomalistic psychology doesn't. Again, it's concerned with claims that will either be explained in terms of natural science or um, or it will just say, well, this is probably explainable, but we just don't know how to explain it yet. So where a parapsychologist would claim that, something like ESP violates certain limiting principles of naturalism, like we're saying that in this case, we're talking about an extrasensory motor exchange of information, which shouldn't be possible, right? Uh, Anomalistic psychology tries to find the naturalistic explanation. It relies on our, what we want from the sciences: falsifiability, replicability, parsimony, the idea that effects follow causes, the causal closure of the physical, right? To get more, even more philosophical, right? And I think some of these phenomena can sometimes be described as uncanny. They can elicit an uncanny sensation. And so anomalistic psychology should look into that, right? So let's start with Jentsch. Um, Jentsch says that without a doubt, this word appears to express that someone to whom something uncanny happens is not quite at home or at ease in the situation concerned, that the thing is or at least seems to be foreign to him. In brief, the word suggests that a lack of orientation is bound up with the uncanniness of a thing or incident. And similarly, Freud writes, the uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. So for Jentsch, it's this unfamiliarity and uncertainty. For Freud, it's a little bit different, right? If you, according to Jentsch, just without going any deeper, if you find something uncanny, Jentsch would say that's because you're unfamiliar with it. It's a new thing, and you're trying to like come to grips with it. Freud would say, well, actually, what's uncanny was once familiar, but is now made unfamiliar because it's been repressed, either repressed, if you're talking about, an individual, or surmounted, if we're talking about society. And we'll get into that difference. We'll unpack that a little more as we go. Beyond that, Jentsch doesn't really attempt to define what the uncanny is. What he actually does is try and identify conditions that obtain that or that need to obtain in order for somebody to experience an uncanny sensation. And all of these conditions for Jentsch involve psychical uncertainty. Now, remember, as I said last time, this does not mean what it means today. right? Today, if I say psychical, you probably think psychic, like a psychic medium or something. But in the early 20th century, or late 19th, early 20th century, psychical just meant mental or intellectual. So we'll say intellectual uncertainty. So some things that can elicit this sense of uncertainty and thereby the uncanny sensation that Jentsch is talking about are certain breakdowns in the senses. Think about when it's dark outside. You could walk through, I'm actually in North Bay right now, where there's a lot of forest, right? I could go walking through the forest in the day, and I bet it would be a lovely walk. I could go look out for some cool animals or something. I've been seeing a lot of interesting birds here. Uh, Probably go out and see some really interesting birds. Maybe some other animals too. But at night, you walk through that same forest and you might feel a little frightened, right? Because you can't see as far. Maybe you hear something in the bush. What's that noise? Is that just the wind? Or is that a bear? Or is it a human who's following me? What is it? Or maybe it's Sasquatch. I don't know, right? So breakdowns of the senses can cause uncertainty and therefore an uncanny sensation. Pharmacological agents like well, things that alter your perception or make you sleepy. Um, Animism, which is our tendency to view the world and things in the world as alive in the same way that we are. And I realize, like, sure, there are a lot of things that are alive in the world, right? If you go into the forest again, you'll see a lot of living things, right? You'll lots of birds, for example. Maybe some other things, maybe foxes, coyotes, stuff like that, right? But I mean, looking at other things as if they were alive in the same way that we are. Not unlike we find in like different shamanistic religions. Like I spoke last time about the Shinto religion in Japan, where the world is populated by kami, sort of spirits or gods, divine beings. And maybe certain very special places might have important kami, like hot springs, forests, mountains. Um, these holy places will have kami associated with them. And maybe we can build a shrine and we can pray to the kami there and pay our respects, right? That's animism. Even the ancient Greeks, which Jentsch notes in his paper, the ancient Greeks were quite a sophisticated people. But Jentsch says of the ancient Greeks, even in highly sophisticated ancient Greece, there was a dryad in every tree, right? Dryads are little tree spirits. Socrates, right? If you're familiar with the character Socrates that we get from Plato, you know that Socrates claims to have a daimonion, a little voice that speaks to him and tells him right from wrong. This has even caused some to speculate that Socrates might have been schizophrenic. He wasn't. I think that's a really silly idea. Um, and it's not necessary to explain Socrates' daimonion, right? The Greeks were animists. Um, if you say, I have a little spirit that talks to me, that is not something a crazy person would say in ancient Greece. That would have reflected the animism in that culture, right? As we've already talked about, wax figures and robots, but also effigies, masks, corpses. Who's been to an open casket funeral? I'm sorry, that's a very morbid question. I hope if you have, it was not recent. But has anyone ever experienced this? Yeah, Kaya, that makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. In other places, maybe the voices are not attributed to the illness, but to another being. That's also a kind of animism, right? If you think about it. Yeah, so a few of you have had an open casket funeral. I have too. And I've got to admit that the that's quite uncanny, right? Seeing a corpse that's all dressed up nice and made to look, you know that they're there and they're dead, but it's uncanny because you've known this person when they were alive. And I think that sort of latent impression of animacy is still there when you're looking at a corpse. It looks like at any moment they could just get up, right? And that's what makes it so strange. Um, but the interesting thing for me is that is Jentsch's use of automata as an example of something which can seem uncanny. And this really foreshadows Masahiro Mori's description of the uncanny valley phenomenon. We would call these robots today. An automaton, automata plural, automaton singular. These are clockwork robots, right? They're not powered by electricity, but by winding up a clockwork mechanism and watching them go. And they can be pretty uncanny when they're, as Jentsch says, united with certain bodily or mental functions. So I'll read you this quote here from Jentsch. For many sensitive souls, a life-size wax or similar figure also has the ability to retain its unpleasantness after the individual has taken a decision as to whether it is animate or not. So here, the uncertainty seems to revolve about over whether something is alive or not. Um, Here it is probably a matter of semi-conscious secondary doubts which are repeatedly and automatically aroused anew when one looks again and perceives the finer details. Or perhaps it is also a mere matter of the lively recollection of the first awkward impression lingering in one's mind. So think again if you've seen an open casket funeral or gone to the wax figure museum, and these things you're looking at look very lifelike, then you've decided, no, that's just a wax figure or that's a corpse. But it doesn't stop you from feeling like you're looking at something that's alive. And that can be really weird, right? Yeah, mannequins too. I don't like going shopping, right? I don't like going clothes shopping because they always have these mannequins. And like, I'm not freaked out by them, but if I'm walking around the store and like out of the corner of my eye, I'm like, oh, there's someone over there. Oh, no, mannequin. Just a mannequin, right? Or same with if they have like a lot of mirrors, I'm always like, who is that? Oh, it's just my reflection, right? I hate it. I don't like it. I don't think we should have them. We could just hang the clothes up. We don't need the mannequins, right? Or yeah, Kaya, similar. Yeah, like imagine so all of a sudden there's a reflection, and you're like, who's that? And it's you, but it's scarier maybe because it's at night, and so um like our senses are kind of dulled, right? We can't see as far. There's less light. So, yeah, Jentsch continues. This is where the impression easily produced by the automatic figures belongs that is so awkward for many people. A doll which closes and opens its eyes by itself, or a small automatic toy, will cause no noticeable sensation of this kind. While on the other hand, for example, the life-size machines that perform complicated tasks, blow trumpets, dance, and so forth, very easily give one a feeling of unease. The finer the mechanism and the truer to nature the formal reproduction, the more strongly will this special effect make its appearance. And that is basically the uncanny valley, right? That he's describing the uncanny valley. This is long before Masahiro Mori, the Japanese roboticist, came up with this way of articulating it. He did that in 1970, I think. And Mori, interestingly, was working on artificial limbs, right? Prosthetic, like robotic limbs. And he thought to himself, like, wow, if you made a whole robot like this, that would be quite unsettling. And he described something very similar to what Jentsch did many years earlier. Um, yeah, when you bump into a mannequin. Yeah, I would say awkward here means uneasy or strange. Like it's like an awkward sensation, something that's maybe a bit uncomfortable, right? And all of this has got to do with psychical uncertainty or mental uncertainty, psychological uncertainty, if you like. Um, Now, I think that on the face of it, just intellectual uncertainty is not enough. It might be a necessary condition for experiencing an uncanny sensation, but it's not a sufficient condition. Because think about it. Often we are uncertain about something or another, but it's comparatively rare to feel an uncanny sensation or a sense of eeriness. I mean, think about it. When was the last time you were uncertain about something? It probably had nothing to do with whether, you know, you were dealing with something that was animate or not. So what do you think? Yeah, what was the last thing I was uncertain about? Probably something as simple as what to get for dinner, right? That's uncertainty. But that's not going to make me feel weird or eerie, right? Rather, it's a certain kind of uncertainty. And for Jentsch, it's uncertainty about whether an animate being might be inanimate in the case of corpses, um, or whether uh, or now I've confused myself. Certainty over it's uncertainty over whether the inanimate is in fact animate and whether the animate is in fact inanimate. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, final exam grades. Well, you might feel anxiety over that, but I wouldn't characterize it as uncanny, right? But certainly that kind of uncertainty could elicit a sense of anxiety. Oh, that's a good example. Yeah, like using one of those mirrors that doesn't do the mirror image but shows you the way other people see you. Yeah, that's I think why I find it weird to look at photographs versus in the mirror. I think it's also why some people don't like hearing their voices, like recordings of their voices or seeing videos of their movements because it's weird, right? Um so like effigies, wax figures, dolls, automata. We can add CGI characters, maybe photographs, paintings, inanimate objects that seem animate, either because of the environment we perceive them in or because of the way that they're depicted, and how they depict what they depict can seem uncanny. Like, I mean, that was a trick that artists used to make paintings seem lifelike. They could paint the eyes in such a way that it appeared to the observers of the painting that it was its gaze was following you as you moved around the room. And there are photographs like this too. So it seems almost like the person depicted in the painting or in the photograph is watching you, right? Which is a bit weird. Um, but then corpses are weird because they used to be animate and are now inanimate, and that creates a sort of awkward impression. So it's perceptual animacy. It's animism. Um, it's not just about the objects and the circumstances, but also about our own animistic tendencies, right? So as I mentioned before, indigenous peoples from around the world have more like shamanistic religions, and animism is often a feature of those. Um, Children are also uh, little animists, right? They've got no problem pretending their toys are alive. Um, so it could be our own. It's not just the environment and it's not just the objects themselves, but it's also something about our own psychology. And what does Zach say here? Recording myself, it's been really weird. Yeah, that's weird. Yeah, like memories from two different perspectives. Yeah. Um, what was I going to say? Maybe if I go back a slide, I'll remember. Oh, right, I remember. I'm not just saying that it's only children or like people who still live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle that have these animistic tendencies. I'm not saying that. We all have them because we have brains that evolved to very quickly detect um, when there is something else that's alive in our environment. And because that might be important, like that would have been important in our evolutionary past, right? And that's why maybe walking in the forest in the daytime feels fine and walking in the forest at night doesn't, right? So you're walking in the forest, you hear a twig snap behind you. Your immediate impulse is probably going to be to turn around and see if you can see any sort of creature, right? Whether it's an animal or another human. Why? Because your brain is like an evolutionarily designed animacy detector. Because what if it's a predator, right? It's better to have a false negative than, or it's better to have a false positive than a false negative in an evolutionary context, right? Because if I'm out there on the savannah hunting and gathering, and I hear what I think is I don't know, a saber-toothed tiger behind me, when it's really just the wind, well, fine. No harm, no foul. I'd be like, saber-toothed tiger. Oh no, it's okay. It's just the wind. Don't worry about it. It's better to have that kind of false positive than a false negative, where I hear a noise and I think, oh, it's probably just the wind. And next thing I know, I'm being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. Then I'm not going to pass my genes on to my offspring. It's not very adaptive, right? So we all have these tendencies, not just children, not just people who subscribe to a shamanistic religion or who live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. No, all of us do. Um, yeah, yeah, the way children interact with those child-sized mannequins, huh? Yeah, yeah, it's weird, right? I remember. I must have been quite young, but I do remember my grandmother explaining. I was watching a show. Anyway, it was like puppets. It was a children's show. I was quite young. And I remember I don't know why. It's such a strange memory, but I do remember my grandmother explaining like, but those are just puppets. And I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? Like I thought that they were beings, not puppets that were controlled by people, right? Um, so I guess maybe that's a bit like the children in the store when they see those tiny mannequins that Sarah's talking about. Would the uncanny valley also apply to things that are animate but seem inanimate? Um, I sometimes get an uncanny feeling when I see an extreme amount of plastic surgery or Botox. That's interesting. Yeah. I think it could. I think it applies whenever there's ontological uncertainty about well, I'm just cutting to the chase right now. I'm telling you, spoiler alert, this is what I think. I think that the uncanny, not necessarily, we don't have to call it the uncanny valley phenomenon because that's like a specific hypothesis that was described for a particular set of uncanny stimuli. But the uncanny itself um, seems to arise when we are uncertain about animacy and also mentation. So, not just about whether something is alive, but also whether or not it has a mind, what its intentions are for us, et cetera, et cetera. What are its mental states, et cetera, et cetera. And this is actually why I think haunted houses are spooky. You go into an old, creepy house, it's an inanimate house, but it seems like the house is alive or there's something alive in the house. Um, Or think of when you see, like, talking about something like Leo mentioned, can it happen with something that's animate that appears inanimate? Yes. Jentsch actually mentions a funny example, like sort of apocryphal tale of an explorer who's in the jungle who sits down on what he thinks is just a log, but then it starts moving. And it turns out it's not a log at all. It was just a snake that had been sitting there, or a big giant snake, right? That would be weird if you think, oh, here, I'm going to sit on this log, and then all of a sudden it starts moving, and you're like, what? It kind of reminds me of that scene in The Two Towers, Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, when Merry and Pippin are in Fangorn Forest trying to escape the orcs, and they climb up a tree, and all of a sudden the tree opens its eyes, and it's not a tree at all. It's an ent. It's Treebeard, right? But but Pippin's reaction, like, ugh, right? Um, that's a good example. Or those animals that are very good at camouflaging. Um, so that, have you ever seen those clips of divers who encounter weird sea creatures that are very camouflaged? They'll have I don't know, an octopus, and it's like it looks like a rock, and all of a sudden it changes color and becomes an octopus and swims away, right? That's kind of freaky in that kind of few seconds where you don't know what you're seeing. That strange feeling, I would say, is a pretty good example of the uncanny. So yeah, it can definitely happen. It's not just when an inanimate object appears to be alive. It could also be when an animate object appears to be not alive. Like those creatures that are so good at camouflaging that you don't see them until they move. And you're like, "Whoa, that stick is moving or that rock is moving." Oh, it's just a snake, just an octopus, right? So absolutely, absolutely. I do want to take a break soon. Maybe we should just talk briefly about what's on this slide. I don't know, actually. How many more slides do we have? Because I forget how many slides I put together for this lecture. Oh, quite a few. 22. We are getting close to halfway through. So we are, yeah, we're exactly halfway through. We could probably take a break. Oh, thanks, Kaya. Yeah. What do you say? Do we want to take a 15-minute break? Kaya says yes. What about everybody else? A little 15, we can go 15 minutes. Okay. So I have 3:32 as the time now. So 42. Let's come back at 3:47 approximately. And then we'll talk about Hoffman's short story because Jentsch kind of mentions that in passing. Freud talks about it at length. So I'll go over the story and what happens, and then we'll talk about Freud, and then we'll kind of do a little bit of adjudication between Freud and Jentsch before I wrap things up. Okay, so I'll see you in about 15 minutes. Okay. I think it's about time we can continue. Over the break, I actually thought of a couple more examples of uncanniness. Um, well, one of them I just thought of a few examples based on Leo's um, comment, people with the extreme amount of plastic surgery or Botox. I was thinking of, oh, what's that guy? Oh, why am I blanking on his name? The American politician from Florida with those eyebrows that go that just should not be doing that. Oh, what's his name? Uh, it escapes me. But yeah, uh, things like that. Where I guess where maybe the face is modified. Not Rudy Giuliani, although his running hair dye is quite no, oh, geez, why can't I think of it? Oh, I had not George Whipple, no. Oh, I can't I just can't think of the name. Eh, anyway, those sorts of faces that deviate from Ron DeSantis. No, not Ron DeSantis. Matt Gates, maybe Matt Gates. It might be Matt Gates I'm thinking of. Um, yeah, it's Matt Gates with his crazy eyebrows and his weird hairline. Like it's like it looks strange, you know. It like deviates from the way we expect. Um, it deviates from our expectations of what a face looks like, I think, and maybe in cases of extreme plastic surgery or surgery that's kind of gone wrong, right? And the face kind of deviates from those proportions that we're used to. That can give you a kind of like, oh, like what the, yeah, yeah, like a super villain. He is kind of a villain, right? Like, wasn't he under investigation for his interactions with underage women, like which is also gross, like but in a kind of like disgusting way, right? So yeah, that's maybe some of that, maybe both of those perceptions kind of feed into each other and make this character like that much more off-putting. Another one I was thinking of was taxidermized animals, right? They can look very strange. I find like, when people hang up fish, they caught a really good fish, so they get it like mounted and preserved. Those look like, just normal, but maybe if I were a fish, I would find that very weird. But whenever it's like a mammal or a bird, it kind of gives me a little bit of a creepy vibe, because it's dead, but it's posed in a way that maybe so that it's mimicking the way the animal would behave when it's alive. That's kind of strange. So there's a couple more examples of uncanniness. And I guess Jentsch would say that's all because of this sort of uncertainty about animacy, right? Maybe it's because we've never seen, yeah, why don't we have that with faux dinosaurs? It could be because none of us has ever seen a dinosaur, so we don't know. Although birds, right? Birds are scientifically speaking avian dinosaurs. And when I see certain birds, some of them really do like give me this dinosaur-like impression that I think I don't find it creepy. I think it's fascinating. But there's this kind of like, ooh, look at that bird. It looks very dinosaur-like. Which I don't know, it doesn't make me feel an eerie sensation, but it does make me feel something like um, and certain birds are more dinosaur-like in that way, like, like those large flightless birds give me more dinosaur vibes than like Canada geese do, right? Um, but maybe all of this is because of what Jentsch thought, which is psychical or intellectual uncertainty, namely uncertainty over whether we've got an animate thing or an inanimate thing, right? Another funny example he uses is that there was this parade being held where they had a big animatronic depiction of the dragon Fafnir from these old Germanic folk tales. And these elephants that were in the parade went crazy because they were frightened of the dragon. And Jentsch jokes that it's because they had not read the trilogy. They had not read the story of they hadn't read the Nibelungenlied, the Song of the Nibelungs, which is the sort of German version of that tale, where we have Fafnir, he's either a dragon or he was a dwarf who becomes a dragon, right? And then if in German it's Siegfried, in the Old Norse stuff it's Sigurd. Um, but they fight this dragon. And that, of course, went on to influence Tolkien and all of that nice stuff. So the elephants obviously hadn't read that story, which is why they were freaked out by this gigantic fire-breathing dragon. Um, yeah. Another example, my dog. I remember we were walking over, taking her for a walk over in Hull, like over on the Gatineau side, and there's a big statue of Maurice Richard, the hockey player, just kind of posed like with his hockey stick. And and the first time my dog laid eyes on this statue, she barked at it as if it was a big giant person about to come to life, right? Or another one. I know I keep rattling off examples. Those people that paint themselves silver and then they just stand there, those street performers, right? That's funny. Freaked out at a portrait I drew. Yeah. Um, yeah, those performance artists, they paint themselves gold or silver and they just stand still for a long, long time and then they move all of a sudden and it's kind of freaky. All of those very much in line with how Jentsch would explain the uncanny, but Freud does something differently. He explains it in terms of the return of the repressed. So there are elements of the psyche that become unfamiliar because we repress them, certain drives and desires and so forth. But they return from repression on Freud's theory. So we might see them in dreams. They'll be sort of censored by the mind, so they'll appear as symbols, or they can appear as fears, anxieties, neuroses in life, right? And the idea with psychoanalysis is that you're supposed to, uh, kind of come to grips with all of this stuff that's been repressed um, by doing a sort of talk therapy, right? Freud also, as I said before the break, talks a lot about this story, The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffman. Jentsch does too, but not as much. He mentions the character Olympia, who is an automaton. Um, but that's not the same part of the story that Freud focuses on. So let's talk about the Sandman. It starts with a series of letters where Nathaniel, the main character, is telling Lothar, who is the brother of Clara, his fiancée, about his anxieties, namely his childhood fear over the Sandman. He says that his governess, nursemaid, whatever the term is, used to tell he and his siblings about the Sandman. Now, the Sandman is a story from Germanic folklore that a lot of you will be familiar with. He's a nice character who sprinkles sand in children's eyes to get them to go to sleep. And that's why, the folklore goes when you wake up, you have, sleep in your eye. You have the sand. That's from the Sandman getting you to fall asleep. But that's not the story that Nathaniel hears. No, Nathaniel hears the story of a Sandman who comes, and if the children are not in bed, he throws hot coals into your eyes. Then your eyes pop out of your skull and dance around on the floor, and he collects those up and takes them to the moon where he lives and feeds the children's eyes to his children, which are these horrible vulture-looking creatures with these awful hooked beaks, and they eat the eyes of children who won't go to sleep. So you better go to sleep, right? Or the Sandman will get you. That's pretty creepy. And Nathaniel believed that this character Coppelius was actually the Sandman. Coppelius used to come over and get up to these weird experiments with his father, with Nathaniel's father. And one day Nathaniel catches them, and Coppelius grabs him and holds him up next to the fire and threatens to hold hot coals over his head and pour them into his eyes. And Nathaniel's father begs him not to. Um, he thinks Coppelius is really the Sandman. A short while later, when Nathaniel's still a child, he hears an explosion in the lab where his father and Coppelius work. His father's killed, and Coppelius disappears for years. And so Nathaniel and Clara and Lothar, all through their correspondence, they all talk, and Clara reads some of these letters and is like, "Hey, Nathaniel, don't worry. Like that was a long time ago. Don't worry about the Sandman. There's no need to worry about the Sandman." So he goes off to university in Italy. Nathaniel does. He goes to study under this Professor Spallanzini, and there he meets a fellow named Coppola, who's a lens salesman. He travels around, he sells spy glasses, reading glasses, magnifying glasses, all kinds of stuff. And it kind of freaks Nathaniel out when he knocks on his door and he's like, "I've got eyes aplenty, right?" And Nathaniel's like, "What do you mean you have eyes aplenty? What? Like, are you the Sandman too? Are you coming to get me finally?" Um, and no, it's just this guy who wants to sell um, lenswear to him. So Nathaniel buys a spyglass from Coppola, and he uses it to spy on the professor's daughter. So Professor Spallanzini's daughter lives across the way, and he can see her through, and he's kind of creeping on his daughter Olympia, and he falls in love with Olympia, completely forgetting about his fiancée Clara. Um, they go to a party held by the professor where Olympia is unveiled to everybody, and everybody kind of knows Olympia is an automaton because Olympia just, kind of sits there and smiles and nods and giggles at you and doesn't really do anything else. So everybody kind of knows that Olympia is an automaton, except for Nathaniel, who dances with her and is completely enamored by her. This is also kind of a commentary on how women were expected to behave at the time, right? Olympia as an automaton, it's kind of like a way of saying like, like, what are we doing here? He's satirizing the way women were expected to behave, robot-like, in modern parlance. So Nathaniel's madly in love with Olympia. He's forgotten all about Clara. But one day he goes up to visit the professor and he sees that Coppola is there, who is revealed at that point to actually be Coppelius from his childhood. He has just had a fight with the professor and he's stealing Olympia's body. Her eyes have fallen out and are rolling around the floor. So he sees the eyes, which are freaky. He sees Olympia being carried off. He sees that she is, in fact, a machine, and this causes Nathaniel to have a mental breakdown and attack the professor. So, sometime later, he's back home. He's recovering. He's back with Clara, and they're walking around seeing some sights. They go up to the top of a tower to look around at the landscape, and Nathaniel sees a figure off in the distance, a familiar figure. And Nathaniel goes nuts and tries to hurl Clara off the balcony or off the tower. Lothar runs up and saves her, but Nathaniel's still going mad. The figure in the crowd, who we see as Coppelius, says, everybody's like, "Oh my God, he's going mad. Somebody has to go get him." And Coppelius says, "Don't worry, he'll come down soon enough." And Nathaniel throws himself off the tower to his death. And Coppelius slash Coppola, who is also the Sandman, it turns out, finally disappears into the crowd, having driven Nathaniel to madness. So, fun story, fun family tale. Now, what Freud does with this is interesting. Uh, so Jentsch definitely thinks that Olympia is the uncanny element here, right? Um, and more generally, in a lot of Hoffman's other works, Jentsch would argue that it's his use of uncertainty that makes it eerie. What is Olympia? Who is Coppelius, right? What were they up to in that laboratory? Is he really the Sandman, right? It's that uncertainty that makes Hoffman's works um, eerie. But Freud says no, it's not that. It's the Sandman himself, right? Who is also Coppelius, who is also Coppola, who wants to take Nathaniel's eyes. This is what makes it uncanny. Why is it uncanny? Well, because Freud thinks that this symbolizes castration anxiety, Castrationangst, right? And this is an anxiety that I guess Freud thinks a lot of us have. Um, the eyes represent the genitals, and Coppelius represents the father who wants to take the genitals. And the genitals further symbolize power, right? So castration anxiety is a fear that you will lose your power. This actually goes a long way back, right? This is how Freud also understands ancient Greek myth, right? What do I mean by that? Well, who's familiar with the Titanomachy? Who knows what the Titanomachy is? Anybody read any Homer or Hesiod? Okay, so let's start with this. Who are the Olympians? Right, the Greek gods. So Zeus, the number kind of changes, but you've got at least Zeus, Hera, and all of their siblings. So Poseidon, Hades, Artemis, right? And then some of the offspring. So Apollo, Hermes, um, Athena, right? These are the gods that live on Mount Olympus. That's right. So Jamal and Lena have it right. And the Titanomachy was the battle between the gods, the Olympians, and the Titans, led by Zeus's father Cronus, right? And if you know the story, right, Cronus has a bunch of kids, but it's foretold that they will usurp his power, like he usurped his father's power. So he eats them all, just swallows them whole. But Gaia sneaks away with Zeus and replaces him with a rock. And so Cronus eats the rock, thinking he's eaten Zeus. But Zeus is actually off being raised in a cave somewhere. And then when Zeus grows up, he frees his children from his father's guts. And then they all fight the Titans and they win, right? And what does Zeus do? Well, he castrates his father and he throws uh, the bits into the sea where they interact with the ocean and that's where some other gods are born. Like that's where Aphrodite comes from, right? So this is actually kind of the lens through which Freud is doing this, right? He's like, oh, it's castration anxiety. Like, think about it. We this is real because we wrote about this in myths in some of our great myths, right? There's castration anxiety there. So here, it's the eyes standing in for the genitals and this fear of losing your power with your genitals, right? But it's repressed. You're not consciously aware of um, your fear of your father's power or your power being taken by, I don't know, either your father or your offspring, right? You're not consciously aware of that because that's been repressed. But it surfaces as an anxiety, namely fear of the eyes being taken or damaged, right? You also see this in Oedipus Rex, right? Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus the King. Who's read that? That's a play by Sophocles. Do we know Oedipus the King? He's famous for something. Yeah, right? What's he famous for? Yeah, marrying his mom. Not just marrying his mom, having kids with his mom. Yeah. And that's where the Oedipus complex come from. That's right. Yeah, he claws his eyes out. Now, interesting. So Oedipus is left to die when he's young because he has a club foot. So that's what Oedipus means, swollen-footed one. So his parents leave him out to die. It's called exposure. You just put the baby outside and forget about it, right? But Oedipus doesn't die. He's found and raised and grows up, and one day um, he kills a man at a crossroads, which turns out to be his father. He doesn't know that, but he kills him. Then he goes back to Thebes, solves the riddle of the Sphinx, so they make him king. So he marries Jocasta, who he doesn't know is his mother. But all of a sudden, this miasma starts affecting Thebes. And the seer Tiresias comes to him and says, "You're the source of this, Oedipus. Just you need to go." And Oedipus wants to know why? Why am I the source? And Tiresias is like, "You don't want to know. Just get out of here, right?" But of course, Oedipus doesn't do that. Oedipus needs to know. So he finds out that he killed his father and marries his mother. When his mother finds out, she hangs herself. And yeah, Oedipus takes the brooches from her robes and stabs his eyes out. Um, Again, Freud would say this is castration angst, right? He would say, um, because in ancient Greece, the punishment for um, incest was castration. So what Oedipus is doing is symbolically castrating himself. And that's probably Sophocles, the author of the play. I mean, I would probably was aware of what he was doing here, of the symbolism. But Freud seems to think it represents some kind of like evidence for return of the repressed, right? I think this is a bit weird, right? Obviously, psychoanalytic explanations are a bit unscientific. The reasons why, depend on who you ask. Some say it's unscientific because they're unfalsifiable, and some say they're unscientific because, well, it's not because they're unfalsifiable. It's just because they're wrong, right? Um, there are also very well understood evolutionary reasons why we would fear damage to the eyes, right? Um, Sight is a very important sensory domain for human beings. It's different for other animals, right? Like think if you're a dog, right? Your main sense that you rely on. I mean, it's arguably sight, but also smell to a great extent. But we don't have the sense of smell that a dog has. We rely on our vision. Or if you're like a bat or a dolphin, right? Sight is important, but it's not as important as sonar, as echolocation, right? So that's a dominant sense if you're a dolphin. Um, but for us, it's sight. So much so that, it's just like a reflexive sort of thing where if something gets close to your eye, you kind of automatically close your eye because, you need your eyesight, right? Um, I would actually also say that the stuff with the eyes is not eerie or weird or creepy in this story. It's just downright frightening. Like, hey, yeah, the Sandman's gonna take your eyes and feed them to his children who live on the moon. Like, that's just horrifying. That's not uncanny. That's just like, don't take my eyes, right? Um, so I don't think that that's the most uncanny part of the story, but Freud would say it is because again, Freud is saying the uncanny is what we are frightened of because it was once familiar but has been made foreign through repression or being surmounted. Like repression is when your individual mind represses something and puts it into the unconscious. Surmounting, when we surmount something, that's when we as a society get beyond it. So animism, right? Freud is actually going to talk about animism. This is where he sort of dresses up Jentsch's answers in his own psychoanalytic terminology. But he is going to say, like, look, this is an old way of looking at the world that most societies have surmounted. They've gotten over it. Like the Greeks were animists, but we are not, right? Hunter-gatherers are animists, but we are not, right? But we still have those tendencies kind of like deep down in the mind. And so that's another source of the uncanny. Um, Yeah, I think actually, again, just to reiterate, it's not the taking of the eyes, it's the uncertainty about who Coppelius Coppola is. Like, Are they the same person? Are they also the Sandman? And what's the Sandman doing? Like, what does he want from Nathaniel? Does he want his eyes? Does he just want to torment him? Seems like at the end of the story, he just wanted to torment Nathaniel because he interfered in his research with Nathaniel's father, right? Um, I think on my reading anyway, that is where the uncanniness in that story comes from. But what do you think? First of all, what did you make of the story, and what do you make so far of the differences between Jentsch's explanation and Freud's explanation? And you can raise your hand or you can hop in the chat. Any thoughts at all? I hope you read it. I really do hope you read it because it's a cool story. It's a cool story. Kaya, yeah. Well, that's interesting. I think maybe that's evidence of what Jentsch is saying, right? Like certain substances which maybe alter the mind. So if you've had an edible and you try and read it, um, maybe it's going to be a little extra freaky, right? So Belle says she found Olympia more uncanny with Nathaniel's madness. Yeah. So would you then say like the Sandman is frightening, but Olympia is that's the weird part, the uncanny part. Oh, so you've read it a few times, Sanadi. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I come back to it every year, mostly every year. I didn't reread it this time because I've read it so many times, but every time I read it, I'm like, yeah, this is a really good creepy story. Like, I like it. Leo says he doesn't agree with Freud's explanation. Tends to tie everything back to genital sex. Yeah, even when it doesn't really have any. Yeah. Although Freud did say sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Um, but you're right. With Freud, it's all like genitals and sex and your mom. Bella says Jentsch nailed it. That's what I think too. I think Jentsch gets it right. He doesn't do it in the same sort of vernacular that we would today. But I think, yeah, basically Jentsch has the right answer. And there are parts of Freud that I think are correct, but they're the parts he borrows from Jentsch, right? Tula. Oh, sorry. That's my dog. Yeah, yeah, like how could Nathaniel just forget about Clara like that? Like what a terrible fiance. Like he goes off to university and falls in love with a robot, completely forgets about his human fiance. Um, again, maybe that could be a commentary on in the same way that Olympia is a sort of commentary, like it's like social commentary on women at the time. Nathaniel could be a bit of a commentary on men and the way men behaved at the time, right? Like here's Nathaniel with this, she's no supermodel, but she's a very nice woman who loves Nathaniel and wants to have a life together and, sounds like she'd be a great partner. And then Nathaniel goes off for this, literally a pretty thing, a nice looking robot, who just kind of sits there and goes, to whatever you say to it, right? Um, yeah. Yeah, like, yeah, exactly, Belle. So I think, there's a lot of like, it's not just a horror story, right? There's actually some really interesting satire and social commentary going on. Um, well, I'm glad some of you read it. Um, hey, buddy. Sorry, my cat has joined us. You guys want to see? Hello, sir. What are you doing over there? Kind of hard to see him right now, but he often likes to interrupt my lectures, so. And his brother's over there. Yeah, he had a medical emergency earlier this year. He's a very good boy, but I had to take him to the emergency vet because he was having trouble breathing. Turns out he has hyperthyroidism. So now he's on medication for that. And I'd like to get him that radioactive iodine treatment, basically very neat. You get an injection of radioactive iodine, which eliminates the cells that overproduce the hormones. The downside is your cat is radioactive for a little while, but that's what I'm looking into. I have three. So there's a dog and two cats. Yeah. And the dog is smaller than the cats. Um, okay, what are some other examples of uncanniness that Freud touches upon? I mean, maybe. I just hope his superpower is not having hyperthyroidism anymore, you know. But, it's pretty good. Like, I was really worried because, like, you got to give him medication every day. So as soon as he got his diagnosis, I was kind of like, oh man, that's impossible. How am I supposed to give a cat a pill twice a day? Like, I'm going to be pulling him off the ceiling or something. But no, he's actually really good about it. He's a very sweet fellow. Um, so it's been good. Um, what are some other examples of uncanniness? Well, Freud touches on a few of them. Um, Yeah, you noticed that, Sanadi. Yeah. Freud randomly brings up how several of his male patients find female genital as uncanny, and then goes on to say something about how homesickness is the yearning to go back to your mom's genitals. Yeah. Yeah, I forgot about that part. Yeah, you're right. He does note that, and that is very weird. But it's like, yeah, like it's familiar because that's where you were born from, but you forgot about it, so now it's kind of like it's just like so weird. Do you know there's a joke? There's a joke. You've all heard of a Freudian slip, right? A Freudian slip. That's when you say one thing, but you mean your mother. Anyway, little Freud humor for you. Yeah, your mom. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe this was because of the time. Like Freud is writing in like I think the Edwardian period, maybe the Victorian period. So, or if it is I don't know my historical periods that well, but the Edwardian period follows the Victorian period, which was and Freud was from Austria, but worked in England for a long time. Where I think probably some of these attitudes towards sex and gender from the Victorian era were still very prevalent. They're very cloistered, we don't talk about sex, right? And Freud's kind of like, oh, why is that? Maybe we're repressing everything, right? Um, yeah, boy mom epidemic. What's the boy mom epidemic? Is that when moms are boyish or moms who have boys? I'm not sure if I know this term. Or like a mom who also has to be like a single mom who also has to do dad stuff. Is that what that is? Oh yeah, kind of like well like Norman Bates. Yeah, or Norma. Well, Norma was so Norma Bates like would be a boy mom if I understand. Or Principal Skinner and Agnes Skinner from The Simpsons. Or is anybody watching Andor, that Star Wars show? There's that one character, Cyril, and his mom. They give me such a like Principal Skinner and Agnes Skinner from The Simpsons dynamic. It's crazy. Yeah, that's freaky. He would have had a lot to say about that, I'm sure. But some of the other examples are the doppelganger, the double goer, like we mentioned earlier. Um, déjà vu, which is French for already seen. So when you have this feeling like you've seen or experienced something before, strange coincidences. The story Freud tells here is hilarious, by the way. And you might not understand why it's hilarious, but I will tell you. He's talking about this. He's in, I forget where, Switzerland, Italy, somewhere like that. And he's lost. And he's trying to find his way back to his hotel. But he keeps finding his way back to the town square where there are these painted women. And again, this speaks to the sort of spirit of the time. When he's talking about these women who are wearing rouge and lipstick, in this time, most women did not wear makeup because it was associated with prostitution. So if you wore makeup in the Victorian or Edwardian period, you were either a sex worker or you would have been accused of being a sex worker, which was frowned upon. And so Freud, a foreign visitor to the city, is trying to get back to his hotel, keeps getting lost, and keeps finding his way back to this town square where there are all of these painted women. He keeps inadvertently going back to the red light district, is what he's saying, where all the sex workers are. And he's like, "Oh my God, people are starting to look at me like, why can't I get out of here?" It's like he keeps winding up back where he started. It's a weird repetition. That's very uncanny. And also, I think it's really funny the way he describes it. Or another thing he calls the omnipotence of thoughts, which is what psychologists today would call magical thinking. And that's the ability of our thoughts to affect the world. Like I said last time, right? Wheel of Fortune, right? Come on, big money, big money. Or when you're cheering really hard for your favorite sports team because you believe that by cheering you can actually help them win, right? That's magical thinking. Um, yeah. So, so this leads back to an animistic worldview, Freud says. He says here, the analysis of cases of the uncanny has led us back to the old animistic view of the universe. A view characterized by the idea that the world was peopled with human spirits, by the narcissistic overrating of one's mental processes, by the omnipotence of thoughts, and the technique of magic that relied on it, by the attribution of carefully graded magical powers or mana to alien persons and things, and by all the inventions with which the unbounded narcissism of that period of development sought to defend itself against the unmistakable sanctions of reality. So Freud really does kind of end up where Jentsch ends up, but he dresses it up differently. So it's animism. Um, it's animism. But Freud thinks that that animistic view of the universe is something that's either been repressed in the individual or surmounted by society. And that's a psychoanalytical take. Jentsch doesn't do that. Jentsch is just like, okay, there are certain primitive peoples, or what we would call hunter-gatherer peoples. There are indigenous communities. There are children, and there are folks like us who maybe are sleepy, or maybe our environment dulls our senses or something, and we're all susceptible to this. Um, Freud also criticizes Jentsch here by saying, on the whole, Jentsch does not go beyond relating the uncanny to the novel and the unfamiliar. That's certainly not true. For him, the essential condition for the emergence of a sense of the uncanny is intellectual certainty. Yes, one would suppose then that the uncanny would always be an area in which a person was unsure of his way around, kind of like Freud in the red light district. The better oriented he was in the world around him, the less likely he would be to find objects and occurrences in it uncanny. Sure, but I don't think that's very charitable. Again, uncertainty is a necessary condition for experiencing the uncanny, but it's not sufficient. It's got to be a certain kind of uncertainty. Oh, hello, sir. It's got to be a certain kind of uncertainty, and as we've discussed, that's probably uncertainty over animacy and mentation, right? That's what Jentsch means when he says that, for example, automatons are more uncanny when they're united with certain bodily or mental functions. He's saying when they move as if they're alive, and when they're behaving intentionally, like as if they have mental states, that's when they get really freaky. So wax figures are kind of creepy, but automata are more creepy. because they move and they appear to move with intention. And besides, Jentsch says that there are individual differences. He doesn't use that language, but he says that, in the sort of language that a modern day psychologist would use, what he's saying is that there are individual differences in terms of people's susceptibility um, to the uncanny. Jentsch is not very susceptible. I'm not super susceptible, but I notice there are some people who are like I had one student, also a teaching assistant, um, who thought like cars are weird because they all look like they have faces, right? And that's called pareidolia, right? When you see meaningful patterns and meaningless information. So the front of a car, it's just, headlights and a bumper and whatnot, but it can look like eyes and a mouth. That's pareidolia, right? Pareidolia is very simple, right? Like if I bust out my little drawing tool, I can just draw a little schematic of a face right here. And that looks, that feels a little bit like looking at a real face, even though it's just two lines and a sort of upside down semicircle, right? That's pareidolia. Um, some people are more susceptible to this. I'm not very susceptible to it, but some people are very susceptible to it, to the extent that they perceive, I don't know, like the figure of Jesus Christ in food, right? Every once in a while, these used to go viral in the news. Now it's social media, but from time to time you hear a news story like, Jesus appears in a grilled cheese sandwich, or Mary appears in a potato chip or something, right? Yeah, grilled cheeses. I used to be before I went to university, I studied business at community college, and I was like, oh my God, I hate this. Oh, yeah, you only live once. And I thought, if I get a diploma from college and go become some department store manager or an accountant, oh man, I'm gonna not like life anymore. Um, so I dropped out and went to university and studied philosophy. But when I was there, I thought I was evil. No, I wasn't evil, but I had an evil idea. I thought, what if I made one of those grilled cheese, panini presses, but every grilled cheese could have a Jesus on it. You just make a panini press that has, whatever figure you want. And now all of your sandwiches can be um, miraculous. Obviously, I never did it. Um, but that's me. That was young Josh, who was, kind of a little bit lost. So you could have a grilled cheeses with every meal if you wanted. But that's pareidolia, right? When you see these figures in ambiguous stimuli, meaningful stuff in ambiguous stimuli, that's pareidolia. That people are more or less susceptible to it, and it could contribute to the uncanny effect, right? Like if you see like a face on a tree just due to pareidolia, that might be a bit freaky because trees aren't supposed to have faces, right? Um, and again, just to reiterate, Jentsch thinks it's not just uncertainty, it's uncertainty over specific things, animacy and mentation. And the more alive or more endowed with mental functions an inanimate object seems to be, or the more absent animacy and mentation are in an animate object, the more weird it feels, right? And again, there's evolutionary reasons for this because we needed to know what, out of all the things in our environment, what's alive and what does it want with us, right? So, Freud rejects intellectual uncertainty as a sufficient condition for the uncanny, but I think that his later discussion here, what I have quoted down here, leads him to conclusions that, if you'll excuse the pun, bear an uncanny similarity to those of Jentsch. And that's that old animistic view of the universe. Um, And compare this with Jentsch, right? Like Jentsch says in his essay that an important factor in the uncanny is the natural tendency of man to infer, in a kind of naive analogy with his own animate state, that things in the external world are also animate, or perhaps more correctly, are animate in the same way. It is all the more impossible to resist this psychological urge, the more primitive the individual's level of intellectual development is. And here, I mean, the terminology is somewhat unfortunate because, primitive has now taken on, sort of negative connotation, or arguably maybe it always had that connotation when we use it to refer to people. But it means, earlier, first, primitive, primary, first. So he could be talking about children. He could be talking about, um, indigenous cultures. I try not to use the word like that. I'll say like, yeah, children are more animistic. Hunter-gatherer societies probably have a more animistic understanding of the universe. But I'm not going to say that's primitive in the sense that it's like old and backward, right? But that's what Jentsch means. Further, it is not astonishing if that which man himself semi-consciously projected onto things from his own being now begins to terrify him in those very things. Or that he is not always capable of exercising the spirits which were created out of his own head from that very head. This inability thus easily produces the feeling of being threatened by something unknown and incomprehensible that is just as enigmatic to the individual as his own psyche usually is as well. And that right there, that's it. That explains it as far as I'm concerned. And I think that what little empirical literature there is on this does back this up. And a lot of that's been done in the context of the Uncanny Valley, right? Research on the Uncanny Valley, like when we look at, uh, for example, one really interesting line of research has to do with the mirror neuron system and how that is implicated when we perceive lifelike motions in a robot. And we've done experiments which find that we use our mirror neuron system, which is a system that is active when we are making a motion and when we observe that same intentional motion being made by someone else. The mirror neuron system is active when we watch a robot hand make intentional movements. Not as much as when we watch a human performing the same movements, but it is activated. There are other studies which show that when we vary sort of like the mechanical motion and the human-like appearance of robots and androids, they do get more sort of weird when they have a human-like appearance but mechanical motion, or human-like motion but mechanical appearance. So it's this kind of mismatch between perceptions and beliefs when it comes to animacy and mentation. Yeah, Clara was also saying to Nathaniel, like, it's these childhood fears, you're an adult now. You don't have to look at the world like this. It was dark in your father's lab. You don't know what they were doing. You thought you saw some kind of occult ritual, but maybe it was just an accident, right? Yeah, exactly. So, what do I think all of this is? As I said earlier, I think that when we encounter something uncanny, we find it so because we have this sort of uncertainty about its ontological nature. Is it alive or not? Does it have a mind or not? And that tends to elicit eeriness, which I think is a kind of emotion. But what are emotions? They are affective states, states that are felt states in the body that are episodic, and they occur in response to important things that happen to us, right? Um, Emotions are different from moods, right? Emotions are episodic, moods are not. Moods tend to last longer. Emotions also have intentionality. So emotions are about things, right? If I am frightened of the bear, well, that's because there's a bear, right? I'm frightened. What is being frightened? Well, frightened. When you're frightened, it's because there's some kind of danger in your immediate environment, right? Moods don't have that. Moods do have phenomenology like emotions. That is, there's something that it's like to experience them. Um, but emotions also have epistemology. That is, they have justification and correctness conditions. So, if I see a bear charging me and I feel fear, I'm justified in feeling that fear, justified in the epistemic sense, because I have good reasons to be afraid. Like there's a bear, I can see it, it's running at me. And I'm also correct because a charging bear is dangerous. It's indicating, I'm about to get attacked by a bear. So I'm justified and correct to feel frightened of the bear. I would not be justified and correct if I was frightened of, a cute puppy running at me, right? Imagine if I was afraid then. Well, there's no danger, so my fear is not correct. I also don't seem to have very good justification for being afraid. Like, it's a really cute puppy. Why would I be afraid of that? It's not a big, scary bear with gigantic, sharp teeth and huge claws, right? So that's emotions, right? Emotions are also valenced, so they can be positive or negative. They're often accompanied by judgments, judgments about what's happening. A bear, I better get out of here. Bears are dangerous, right? Of course, they're accompanied by changes in the body. So facial expression, there are distinct facial expressions for different emotions. Some of them are universal. So across all human cultures, facial expressions for things like happiness, surprise, disgust, fear, and anger they're pretty much universal. They're the same whatever culture you look at. But also changes in respiration, heart rate, skin conductance, hormone levels, body posture, right? Because certain emotions might prepare us for action. If I see a bear and I become frightened, I might uh, freeze, or I might run away, or I might get ready to fight the bear, right? And there's some variation on whether emotions are primarily cognitive, whether they're like judgments, or whether they're more like perceptions. Diana and Tironi here actually say that emotions are embodied um, evaluative attitudes. So they're like attitudes we have towards things that embody certain values, danger in the case of a charging bear. Um, love in the case of a partner. But they're embodied because we feel them. We don't just, endorse them. They're not just propositional, like I value that P. They're felt, right? So theirs is a really interesting book. And I actually use that in my class on the emotions. So no theory of emotion does a completely satisfactory job, but um, many agree that emotions represent important organism environment relations. So fear might represent danger and prepare you to flee. Sadness represents a loss. Anger might represent an injustice or an offense and elicit a desire to retaliate. Anger can also occur when autonomy norms are violated. So, like, I'm an autonomous individual, and I've decided for myself that I don't want to be punched in the face. So if someone punches me in the face, that's a violation of my bodily autonomy, and I'll become angry and retaliate, perhaps by punching them in the face, right? Happiness, something good has happened to you. Maybe you're happy because you've achieved a goal or you have gained something, right? So what is eeriness then? Well, I think eeriness is a type of fear, like Freud said, but more specifically, it's not a type of frightening or fear or fright that's related to the familiar being made unfamiliar through repression and then returning from repression. No, I think it's a type of anxiety. Now, anxiety is a type of fear whose intentional object, what it's about, is uncertainty. It's very easy to point out the intentionality of lots of different emotions, right? Like, why am I happy? Well, maybe I won the lottery, right? So I've got this windfall gain. Now I've got lots and lots of money, and I don't have to worry about paying my bills again. Uh, so um, so I'm happy, right? Because I gained something. I'm sad because I lost something. Maybe lost a friend, a family member, or relative. You feel sadness. And that's representing that you've lost something that's important to you. Um, so it's very easy to kind of specialize or specify the intentionality of certain emotions. It's less easy with anxiety because anxiety sometimes, and if you've experienced anxiety, which I'm sure most of you have because you're university students, oftentimes you don't know what you're anxious about, right? You're just anxious. And so when anxiety is a mood, because anxiety can be a mood as well as an emotion. When anxiety is a mood, if you have an anxiety disorder, you might feel anxious a lot and not know why. There might be no clear reason for it. Could be, it could just be an underlying mental condition. It could be due to substance abuse, right? But when it's a mood, it's kind of like it's persisting for a long time and you don't really know, okay, why am I feeling this way? I don't know. But when anxiety is an emotion, it's because of uncertainty. Uncertainty is the intentional object of anxiety. Think of performance anxiety. You've got to give a presentation and you're nervous. Why are you nervous? Well, because you don't know how it's going to go, right? So you're nervous about it. You're anxious. Um, And I think that eeriness is a kind of anxiety that's elicited by uncertainty over whether beings that are inanimate may not, in fact, be animate, and vice versa, and whether those things are endowed with mental functions. So, eeriness is this type of anxiety that we experience, and this gels nicely with the sort of categorization difficulty literature from psychology on the uncanny valley. We have trouble categorizing these things, these uncanny stimuli. Is it human or a robot? Is it alive or is it inanimate? Does it have a mind or is it just a stupid computer, right? But that doesn't explain the phenomenology. Uh, but by kind of filling out what we think eeriness is as an emotion, maybe that can help us with the phenomenology. And I think it's a type of eeriness or a type of anxiety. Um, like think about it when you misperceive a presence, a mind, or a living being when there is none. What are some examples beyond robots and bad computer generated imagery and computer animation? Well, I mentioned earlier haunted house. If you're in a haunted house, maybe you feel like there's a presence there, but you can't see anything. And it feels like there's a presence there because you're hearing all these weird noises, perhaps, in the house. So your little animacy detecting brain is going, oh, there's something here, but you can't see anything with your senses. And so you're like, what is here? Why can't I see it? What does it want with me? That's pretty creepy. That's pretty scary. So I think, yeah, the unique phenomenology of eeriness is due to the phenomenology of the what it's like to perceive and interact with real living beings with minds. And when it feels like that, when there's nothing there, when you're like, okay, here's this inanimate object or this location where I can't see any living beings, but it feels like there's something alive here and it feels like there's something with a mind. That's eeriness. That's the uncanny valley. Yeah, exactly. Like misperceptions, like Bell's example, where you see clothes and you think it's a person. Yeah. Or even children who think that there are monsters under their bed or in their closet, right? Because children have very active imaginations. They're probably less good at than adults are at discriminating, what's alive and what's not, because they're like natural born animists, right? It's even happened to me. I remember when I was working on this thesis or working on some of the ideas leading up to it. I was living in residence at the time at Leeds House on the Carleton campus, and I went outside for a cigarette. Um, don't smoke, by the way. Terrible idea. But I went outside for a cigarette, and I was tired, because I'm a night owl. So it was late at night, and I'm just puffing away outside. And I saw a figure in the window, and I thought it was somebody watching me. And it felt strange, like I was being watched. And then I turned and looked and I saw that it was just a vase of flowers that somebody had put in their window. But for a second, it looked like a person and it felt like that person was watching me. Kind of like the eyes in the photographs or the paintings that appear to follow you. Feels like you're being watched. Another example is a really interesting one comes from Jean-Paul Sartre, right? The seeing eye of the other, right? And he has us imagine, imagine yourself spying on somebody through a keyhole in a door, and you're spying. They don't know they're being watched, but you're watching them. And then all of a sudden you realize that somebody's watching you, watching them. You start to feel very weird. So it's the idea of being watched. It's what it feels like to interact with, an agent with a mind that has intentional mental states, intentional behaviors. That feels a certain way. And when we get that feeling when there is no such entity, that can feel very, very strange. And that is why we're talking about this in this class, right? Because a lot of anomalous experiences are going to involve those kinds of circumstances, not just the uncanny valley phenomenon, but, going to a haunted house or something, right? Or walking through a creepy forest. Like Jentsch says, the human desire for intellectual mastery of one's environment is a strong one. Intellectual uncertainty provides psychical shelter in the struggle for existence. However it came to be, it signifies a defensive position against the assault of hostile forces and the lack of such certainty. And the lack of such certainty is equivalent to lack of cover in the episodes of that never-ending war of the human and organic world, for the sake of which the strongest and most impregnable bastions of science were erected. We don't like feeling uncertain, right? And we understand a whole lot more about the world now because we have science. We understand we need to be less frightened of things we thought were out there. The spirits created from our own head, we need no longer be frightened of because we've developed means of understanding the world, like science. Um, but it can still happen that certain circumstances or people or objects or events can push those old evolutionary buttons and make us feel very uncertain. And if we're uncertain about animacy or mentation or anything like that, that can very easily lead to an uncanny sensation. So, in this little talk slash lecture, I've argued that a naturalistic account of the uncanny, like the one I've given here, can help inform research on the uncanny valley phenomenon. It might prove beneficial to scholarship on the uncanny in the humanities, and it might also make an important contribution to anomalistic psychology, which is kind of not many people are doing much with these days. And I've tried to show this by adjudicating between Jentsch and Freud and their respective accounts on the uncanny. And I think that both of them assign an important role to animacy and animism, but I think Jentsch does a better job of it. I've also provided the sketch of eeriness as an emotion. It's a type of anxiety whose intentionality um, concerns uncertainty over animacy and mentation specifically. It's not just ontological uncertainty, like is it a dog or is it a cat? Um, is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's not that. It's specific kinds. Well, bird, plane, animate, inanimate. But it's not just uncertainty like, oh, what shall I have for dinner? No, it's uncertainty like over whether something is alive or not, whether it has a mind or not. Okay, so for next time, what I'm going to do, because Monday is the holiday, what I'm going to do is deliver instructions for your essay proposal and your final research essay. So we'll only have one lecture. We'll spend it going over the instructions, and maybe we can generate some topics, some possible topics. I'd like to also provide a list of topics, so we'll come up with some together, and then I'll come up with a few more, and I'll make that list available. You can write on something else if you want to. I just think it's kind of helpful to have some possible topics to choose from because some students, they're not really sure what to write about, and it's kind of like, I don't want to come up with something. Just give me something to write on. So I will do that if you think that will be helpful. Reminder, there's been an extension on participation element one. So if you want to do that, you don't have to, but if you do, do it by 11:59 p.m. on this Friday, the 16th. And I'm going to extend the deadline for the first reflection assignment to Tuesday, May 20th. And that'll be due just before midnight. Later tonight, I should have the instructions ready, and the instructions will come in the template. Delete the instructions before you submit it. Okay. But it's very straightforward. Again, it's going to have two parts. You're going to aim for 500 to 750 words. Um, Tell me about a weird, anomalous, supernatural, paranormal, or uncanny experience, and then reflect on it. And you know what will really, really, you know what I'll be looking for an A plus for like stuff in an A plus range. It's not just that it's excellently written, free of errors, uses terminology we've been using. Um, and follows the instructions. A really good one will have a sort of narrative slant to it. You know, it'll make a good tale, a good story, right? Don't make it up, okay? Don't make it up. You don't have to make it up. If you haven't had an experience like this, then that can be your story. Like, oh, all my life I've longed to spend the evening at a haunted house, but alas, I've never had the opportunity. And that makes me feel this way and that way, et cetera, right? So I'll have all of that ready. We are finished a little early. Does anyone have any questions before we go? It could be questions about the assignment, or it could be questions about today's topic. Could be anything. Well, if there are no questions, that's good. I guess that means I've explained everything reasonably well. Then again, maybe you're trying to think of a question. That's okay too. I can hang around a couple more minutes. I guess one thing I really should reemphasize is there's a lot, which I have done in other work, but not this talk slash lecture, and that is the idea of misperceiving. You know, me thinking that vase full of flowers was a person is a misperception. Seeing a face in the clouds is a misperception. And technically seeing, looking at a robot and having that feel like you're looking at an animate being is a misperception. And in my work on the Uncanny Valley, elsewhere, I've talked about how, robots and similar artifacts do this um, in a way that's almost analogous to a perceptual illusion. So that's another way you can think of this, is that when you perceive animacy where there is no animate being, or mentation where there is no mind, or when you fail to perceive mentation and animacy in a living being with a mind, that's kind of like an optical illusion or a perceptual illusion, right? Where you see what isn't really there. So I guess that's the last thing I'd like to emphasize. But that's all I have for you today. It's funny, in the past, I've stretched this lecture out over two lectures, but I guess it's fortunate that I was able to compress things because we did lose that class last Wednesday owing to my illness. But as of now, we're all caught up. So if you don't have any questions, then that's it for today. And if you do think of something, you can always reach out via email or on the Discord server. Yes, thanks. Thanks to you all too. This was a fun one. I always love talking about this stuff. Uh, do keep all of this in mind as we go. I think what we've talked about today is somewhat foundational for a lot of the other discussions that we'll have. So do keep it in mind. But otherwise, I will see you next Wednesday because we don't have class on Monday. And I will post the template and the instructions for the reflection assignment later this evening. And I'll make an announcement to let you know when they're up and where you can find them. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.